This is the fourth lecture of Osher at Dartmouth 2025 Summer Lecture Series. This year's theme is Preserving America's Four Freedoms, the Heart of Our Democracy. My name is Ann Hargraves, and I am the moderator for today's lecture. On behalf of Osher at Dartmouth, I would like to welcome the in-person attendees here in the Lebanon Opera House in Lebanon, New Hampshire. I would also like to welcome the members and non-members who are participating in today's session via live stream. I would also like to welcome our sister Osher Lifelong Learning Institutes at Brandeis University, at Towson University, at the University of Connecticut, at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia, at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, Mass., at the University of Michigan, at the University of Richmond, at the University of Rhode Island, at the University of Virginia. A lot of work goes into producing and supporting each summer lecture series. We would like to thank the members of the 2025 Summer Lecture Series Committee, the dinner hosts, the volunteers working today, the Lebanon Opera House for hosting this year's Summer Lecture Series, the Lebanon Opera House technical support staff, and Junction Arts and Media, KAM, for their live streaming technical help. We thank the Osher at Dartmouth staff and today's speaker, Dean Matthew Slaughter. A special thanks to the sponsors of this year's Summer Lecture Series for their financial support of these important lectures. Our platinum sponsor, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, our gold sponsors, Doyle and Lohman, Kendall at Hanover, and the Village at White River Junction, and our bronze sponsors for today's lecture, Commonwealth Financial, Carson Wealth. Please give a hand to all these people and organizations. Some rules of the road. For those in the live audience here at Lebanon Opera House, please mute your phones and note the locations of the emergency exits to the left and right of the stage. For those in the Opera House today, please write any questions you have on the index card you received when you arrived. For those online, type your questions into the chat window on your screen. A Q&A period will take place following intermission. This should start at about 10:30. We will collect the index cards and chat questions during the first few minutes of intermission, at which point we need to gather and organize them for the Q&A period. If you like, add your first name and location. There will be a post-lecture discussion immediately following today's lecture. It will take place down the block at 1 Court Street in Osher Classroom 3A on the 3rd floor. It's scheduled to last from 11:45 to 12:15 p.m. It is now my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Dean Matt Slaughter. Matt is the Paul Danos Dean of the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth and the Earl C. Daum, 1924, Professor of International Business at Tuck. He is also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a research association at the National Bureau of Economic Research, a member of the Aspen Institute's Economic Strategy Group, and an academic advisor to the McKinsey Global Institute. Much of his recent work has focused on the global operations of multinational firms and on public policies to build economic opportunity. From 2005 to 2007, Matt served as a member on the Council of Economic Advisors in the Executive Office of the President. Matt regularly contributes op-ed columns and is a regular guest on many TV and radio programs. And as a lifetime independent, he works with leaders of both political parties. The title of Dean Slaughter's lecture is The Implications of Trump's Economic Policies. Let's welcome Matt Slaughter.
Good morning, everyone, and Anne, thank you for that very kind introduction. It's a real honor to be here. I love Osher. It's a wonderful institution in the Dartmouth and broader Upper Valley communities, so I'm really honored to have this conversation with us today. So I've got some slides that will accompany my opening thoughts on these issues. If anyone wants to have them afterwards, you can have them, which is great. But they're just meant to guide our conversation. And I'll stress conversation, which will be great after the break. But I think there's 3 questions I'd like us all to consider. And then I'll walk through each of these questions. I might have a few data displays, but it's not meant to be an eye test. And it'll just kind of help us understand some issues in context, is what I mentioned. So the first is just, I think it's important we try to understand what's the political economy issue that President Trump is speaking to. So we'll spend a little bit of time just answering that with a bit of history. And then we'll talk about what economists call productivity. We'll spend a little time on that and its distribution, because that's really what matters most for the economic performance of any country like the United States. And then we'll take a look at likely implications of what has happened thus far under President Trump in his second administration. I'll focus in particular on trade policy and tax policy, because those are the 2 areas where there's been the most action so far. And then we'll think, at last, this will kind of lead to the break, thinking about what other policies the United States might pursue. And to me, this is really a question about leadership, ultimately. It's a question about which leaders articulate compelling visions for the future. And as Anne kindly said, I'm a lifetime independent. I had the honor of working under President Bush 43 in the White House for a couple of years. Under Ben Bernanke was my boss at a little agency called the Council of Economic Advisors. And I'm an economist. I have the honor at Tuck of serving as dean, and I'm an optimist. So if you remember the Winnie the Pooh characters, I'm kind of a Tigger. And yeah, I think some of the issues we're going to talk about are not all that Tiggerish, okay? So there we are. First question is, what political economy issue is President Trump speaking to? The answer is the American dream. I think the more accurate answer is the perception, the widespread perception in the United States that the American dream has faded or has disappeared altogether. So I love the theme of this summer's series around the FDR's 4 wants. We're really talking, if you go back to his speech where he delivered and spoke about those 4 wants, the 3rd want, and the absence of want from need. A couple years before FDR came to office, an American, James Truslow Adams, I think he was American, wrote this story, this piece called The Epic of America, and he's widely thought to be the first person to whom the metaphor of the American dream is attributed. So here's a passage from The Epic of America. The American dream, that dream of a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone. I'll jump ahead. It is not a dream of motor cars and high wages merely, but a dream of social order in which each man and each woman shall be able to attain the fullest stature of which they are innately capable, and be recognized by others for what they are, regardless of the fortuitous circumstances of birth or position. Boy, there's a lot in there. And I think to me it harkens back to, I think if you go all the way back to some of the classic philosophers, Aristotle, in his famous work, The Nicomachean Ethics, used the word eudaimonia, in Greek, the sense of flourishing. That human beings, whatever their talents and capabilities, can flourish in their private and personal lives, and broadly in the body politic somehow. So I think all of us, some in this room maybe had a sense that you lived the American dream. I feel very fortunate. I feel that I and my family has. But the challenge is, I believe, and this I believe is what Donald Trump, regardless of what else you might think the president is doing, he is speaking to the sense of a faded American dream. Let's look at a little data on that. Here's a question that the Wall Street Journal, in conjunction with a polling organization at the University of Chicago, has been asking for many years. I'm going to show us the answers in a moment. The question is, do you feel confident or not confident that life for our children's generation will be better than it has been for us? It's well known in a lot of academic literatures, if you really want to elicit the underlying sentiments of individuals, don't ask them about themselves, ask them about their children. And I think most of us would love to live in a society, a country, a world, arguably, where most people would answer yes to this question. And what's bracing, I think, to me, is not exactly Tiggerish, is how in questions like this, you see people voicing a sentiment that the American dream is fading. 1990, 50% of Americans confident, 45% not confident. 2000, 49, 42. But look at them, the decline, the ongoing grinding decline in the answers to that question. Last time the journal asked it in 2023, only 21% of Americans said they were confident that the future for our children will be better. 21%. 78% said they were not confident. I'll point out, as you start to think about economics, maybe we're pretty close to full employment in 2023. So it's not a matter of the number of jobs, it's a question to preview a little bit the quality of those jobs, and that's related to productivity. But there is, in similar questions, these kind of thermometer questions they're called, you just see a pervasive sense in the United States that has been building in recent years that the American dream is fading. In some measures, the young believe this even more than those of us in this room do. There's a couple of young people I see, but on average we're a little older than the median age in America. So here's a question kind of similar to what we just looked at. Statement A, the United States is a country where anyone, regardless of their background, can work hard, succeed, and be comfortable financially. Or statement B, the widening gap between the incomes of the wealthy and everyone else is undermining the idea that every American has the opportunity to move up to a better standard of living. I teach in a second-year MBA elective course at Tuck. These are students who have earned admission to the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. Not to sound like a commercial, but it's one of the, I think, most vibrant business schools that's out there in the world. They are people who have earned admission. They come back from their summer internships. Many of them have job offers, from the leading, most innovative companies on the planet. And they have a guaranteed job offer, many of them in the classroom. I teach it to second years. I ask this at the beginning of the class every fall. Here's the answers. The course is called LGE, Leadership in the Global Economy. And when I asked it 10 years ago, it was split 50-50 in the class. And when I asked it last fall, the crosstabs had shifted. 1 in 5 students in my class, relative to 10 years ago, had shifted to saying, no, America, it's working hard and effort, but you cannot necessarily succeed. That's kind of striking. And it's not just a US phenomenon, and we might in the discussion, I'm going to focus on the United States, but this is a phenomenon that many other sovereign nations are seeing. This is probably too hard to read. I'll just give you the highlights. You can look at it later. There's a firm called Edelman. Every year they do a survey of individuals around the world. This is in, should know, 30-ish countries. 28. And the question they asked was, my family and I will be better off in 5 years. And if you can read the headline, it says from what Edelman put out a couple years ago when they did this, economic optimism collapses. Countries over here by me on the right, their countries where the bar is being higher indicate a higher fraction of people in those countries said, oh, my family and I will be better off in 5 years. Kenya, Indonesia, India, UAE, China, Nigeria. I'll point out, if you like the economics, those are fast productivity growth countries. We'll come back to that in a minute. But then you walk down here, here's the United States at 36%, but you keep going. Spain, 26%, UK, 23%, Netherlands, 19%, Italy, 18%, Germany, 15%, France, 12%, Japan, 9%. So to some extent, I think the political economy unease in America is a very global phenomenon. And when you start to connect the dots with the Brexit vote in the UK almost 10 years ago, with the rise of the AfD, anti-immigration party in Germany, you see the sentiment in a lot of advanced countries where productivity growth has been very slow, where there's more of a sense of it isn't working very well. So what economic forces have contributed to this? It's productivity and the distribution thereof. So let me say a minute about productivity, and then I'll show us a couple charts, okay? Productivity, think of it as output per worker in the overall economy. Across all the industries that they have, whether it's higher education, theater services, manufacturing, healthcare, consultancy, finance. Average across all the workers how much output they produce and divide by the number of workers. That's kind of an in-the-weeds economic measure. It is the single most important measure almost any economist will tell you about the overall economic health and strength of a sovereign nation. Higher productivity levels, that is growth in productivity and hopefully fast growth in productivity, is the only way that sovereign nations realize sustained increases in standards of living. Because of how the markets work, higher growth in productivity ultimately feeds through to higher incomes, wages for workers in inflation-adjusted terms. And that's what builds sustainable increases in real wealth and all the things that tend to come from that in our lexicon tends to build the American dream. Right? Empowering opportunity for individuals and their children. What makes workers more productive? That's largely a question in market economies of what makes companies more productive. And the biggest thing that does that is the overall innovation that happens inside companies. Their ability to come up with entire new products like this clicker and information technology and healthcare innovations and new medicines and so on and so forth. So it's coming up with entirely new products. It's also, for the existing ones we have, figuring out more efficient ways to make those products, to make them without needing as many people and what economists call capital, the hardware and things that go with their work. And a lot of you in your professional lives probably experienced and were involved in your organizations, your companies becoming more productive. That's what builds sustainable increases in standards of living is productivity growth. Sovereign governments can play a role in nurturing that growth and productivity in a few important ways. One is, do they actually build a policy environment that allows the creation of ideas, and in particular, allows the broad sharing of ideas once those ideas are created? In the jargon of economics, creating new knowledge and new ideas is a public good. The social benefits are typically a lot larger than they are to the private actors that create those new ideas and new products. So the United States Constitution, our founders were savvy enough and intelligent enough to recognize the value of innovation. In the Constitution is what's typically called the patent clause that allows inventors to have monopoly rights for short periods of time on the inventions that they create. And over time, the second big thing that governments can do, they can help build what economists call, and I'll come back to it at the end of my opening remarks, human capital. The knowledge and skills and capabilities each of us has as people that we can bring to our workaday lives. So building reading skills and writing skills and executive function skills and teamwork skills, the kind of things ideally we start to learn in the United States lexicon today in kindergarten, all the way through middle school, high school, perhaps college, perhaps post-college learning. So sovereign nations can build human capital in different ways. Again, look at United States history. We were very good at this for lots of periods of time. In 1862, even as the Civil War was widening in scope and horror, a Vermont senator, Justin Morrell, introduced into the Congress the Morrell Act to create the land-grant colleges. And it got through the House and Senate very quickly, and President Lincoln signed it, and that ushered in the creation of some of the most important and innovative institutions of building human capital in the United States. Massachusetts Institute of Technology, for example. And then the third broad thing governments can do is we could build connections to the rest of the world. Engagement with the rest of the world for a country generates productivity growth in all sorts of ways. The competition through international trade and investment compel companies to be more innovative. One of the biggest ways that we experience it as the United States has been high talent immigrants coming from the rest of the world. Right? We get to enjoy that in American higher education. We're one of the most immigrant-intensive industries around. So governments can do very important things. It's not obvious, do A, then you get productivity growth B. Your governments can build the precondition to try to raise the standards of living through growth and productivity. And hopefully that's widely shared and distributed in terms of the incomes that people earn. So I'm going to show us a picture of growth and productivity in the United States. The message is it has been very slow compared to the post-World War II decades. I'll show us a second picture showing us rising inequality of the income coming from that productivity growth. And that is what fuels the sense of a fading American dream. I just told you what this picture is. We won't spend too much time on it. What I want you to see is the tall bar on the left, 1947 to 1973. Productivity growth in the United States averaged almost 3% per year. At that rate of productivity growth, at standards of living on average double about every generation, about every 20 years. And it was a time where there was growth in incomes for lots of workers, very high talent, very modestly talented people, and there's a sense of the American economy doing very well. And then for a set of reasons we can talk about, the other thing I want you to see in this picture is after 1973, the past 52 years, other than this burst in productivity for 10 years related to the globalization of the information technology industry in particular, other than that one decade, we've had much slower growth in productivity in the United States. That is a fundamental reason that we have this sense of a fading American dream. You might remember President Kennedy gave some speeches talking about the rising tide lifting all the boats. Think of the rising tide as productivity growth, and hopefully that grows quickly. It has not been growing quickly in the United States, nor in a lot of the other countries that we looked at a moment ago. And in terms of lifting all the boats, wow, especially in the past 20 years or so, not many boats have been being lifted in terms of growth of income. So growth in incomes has become more unequal. What slower productivity growth we've had in terms of the labor market outcomes has been more unequally distributed. Here's one measure of that, change in total money earnings of American workers, real meaning adjusted for inflation, from the beginning of this century up until the election in 2016. You can see the skills ladder here. The basic message I want you to see is high school or less, earnings change by educational group of a decline of 0.7%. Some college, decline of 7.2% over those 16 years. College graduates, just a BA, a decline of 4.3%. Non-professional master's degrees, master's in public policy, social work, a decline of 5.5%. In that first almost generation of this 20th century, 96.5% of American workers were in educational classes whose average earnings were falling, not rising. The only boats being lifted were the people with advanced professional degrees and those with PhDs. Why has income growth become more unequal? There's a vast academic literature on that. The short answer, I would say, is the scalability of talent. Individuals who hard work or good luck tend to be more talented in the US and global economy today, can scale their talents thanks to the opening of the world economy, thanks to technology innovations that allow the scaling of talent, to have their labor market returns be much higher than they used to be in earlier times. Thus, a few people that can generate a hedge fund that has tens of billions of dollars of assets under management. Thus, the ability of star athletes to scale what they do to viewers around the world. So we see this in a lot of kind of occupations that we know of. This has been happening in the United States and in lots of other countries as well. Implications, one implications of those two economic forces of slower productivity growth and rising inequality of income distribution. People legitimately have a sense that they are earning less than their parents used to. Raj Chetty, despite what my mom and mother-in-law think I'll never win the Nobel Prize in economics, Raj Chetty will probably win the Nobel Prize in economics someday for amazing research he and colleagues have done like this picture. Amazing in terms of how difficult it was, not amazing in terms of the message. They linked together tax returns data through Social Security numbers for parents and children across decades and decades. And then they asked very simple American dream-like questions. This question was, look at every single American born in a given year, because they had the whole population, thanks to IRS records, of every single American. Look out 30 years, look at the earnings that get reported to the IRS of those people 30 years later, and look back then, are they earning more than their parents did? I think most of us like to think, boy, in the American dream, growth in productivity and incomes, yeah, almost everybody's incomes when they become young adults are larger than their parents were. Not every single person might want that, but on average, we'd like to see a lot of that. And for the birth cohort in 1940, in 1970, their earnings, 92% of Americans alive who were born in 1940, in 1970 who were alive, were earning more in inflation-adjusted terms than their parents. And the message of this chart is very clear. It slopes down. The cohort born in 1984, only 50% of them in the year 2014 were earning more than their parents were. That's an implication of slow growth in productivity and an implication of the rising inequality of that. In another picture, income through various channels tends to get mediated into the wealth, the net worth of households, and what we also see during this period is rising inequality of wealth. Here's one measure of that. The Federal Reserve surveys households every 3 years, gets data from them on their assets and their liabilities. From 1990 here to the last time the Fed asked this, I think 2023, it's got two lines. The red line is the wealth of the middle class, defined here as earners between the 20th and 80th percentile, so 60% of American households. Their total wealth as a share of national wealth fell from 36 to 26%. And the top 1% over that time period, their wealth rose from 13 to 26%. These are data. We can then think about value judgments around the data and whether they're good things or bad things. I think it is hard to dispute, however, that these sorts of data, outcomes driven by the two economic forces of slower growth and productivity and rising inequality, the distribution of those labor market gains of that slower productivity, explain the sense of a faded American dream. And if you go back and read or watch President Trump's inaugural address in 2017 and the one earlier this calendar year, substantial portions of it were speaking to Americans about that faded American dream in quite stark terms. For many decades, we've enriched foreign industry at the expense of American industry. We've defended other nations' borders while refusing to defend our own and spent trillions and trillions of dollars overseas while America's infrastructure has fallen into disrepair and decay. We've made other countries rich while the wealth, strength, and confidence of our country has dissipated over the horizon. One by one, the factories shuttered and left our shores with not even a thought about the millions and millions of American workers that were left behind. The wealth of our middle class has been ripped from their homes and then redistributed across the world. So President Trump went on to say, we are issuing a new decree from this day forward. A new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it is going to be only America first, because he wanted to stop what he called the American carnage. Every decision on trade, on taxes, on immigration, on foreign affairs will be made to benefit American workers and American families. And he said very similar things about 6 months ago. Our sovereignty will be reclaimed. We will flourish and be respected again all over the world. Our top priority will be to create a nation that is proud, prosperous, and free. America will soon be greater, stronger, and far more exceptional than ever before. Now, regardless of what motives anyone in this room or online might impute to thinking about what animates President Trump and his administration and at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue Congress right now, I think it is difficult to deny that President Trump has tapped into the anxiety that is widespread across this country about the faded American dream. He has very clear solutions. He believes the problem is engagement with the global economy. So literally and metaphorically, he wants to build walls. And again, academic research shows very clearly building walls will actually impede growth and productivity, not accelerate it. And if anything, it'll make income distribution less equal rather than more equal. I'll show us that in a minute. But I think it's important, before we go and talk about the implications of some of these policies, to understand this is the economic and the political economy context that we find ourselves in as a country. And again, we might discuss this after many other countries as well. Britain, Germany, France, the Gilets jaunes protest in France a number of years ago against escalated gasoline taxes. You see a commonality in many of these sovereign nations of a lot of people of a sense of their country's economic and political system isn't working. So, what are the likely implications of the president's policies? The two where there's been the most progress so far have been on international trade and on fiscal policy, tax and spending. So I'll spend a few minutes on each of those. And then I'll highlight the one thing to keep in mind in the background that's going on somewhat independent of all of this is this innovation called artificial intelligence and the move towards what's called generative artificial intelligence and what that might do to productivity growth. But let's focus first on a couple of slides on trade, a few slides on taxes. In early April, President Trump assembled a bunch of folks in the Rose Garden and said it's Liberation Day. Put up a chart of all the tariff rates the United States was going to impose against almost every other country in the world, based on what seemed to be a kind of loosely created formula that had little bearing to academic research and how most policy work thinks about trade. But there we are. And so the Budget Lab at Yale University has been tracking a lot of the policy implications of what's been going on quite closely. So I'm going to show some charts from them in particular. This shows the average tariff rate of the United States, averaged across all the industries where we're importing goods. So remember, tariffs are taxes that governments place at their border on goods coming in from the rest of the world. So that's what tariffs are, border taxes on goods being brought into the country. And so you can see here, over the history of the United States, we had really high tariff rates in the early days of the Republic. That was not uncommon because if you don't have a sufficiently developed and robust public state and the ability to think about levying taxes on other economic activities, like labor income or capital income or ownership of assets, when you're a young fledgling nation, one of the easiest kinds of taxes to raise, especially back then before airplanes and everything else, was put people at ports, and when the ships show up, levy taxes on what's coming in. But in part because of academic research that shows border taxes are actually, in many ways, impede growth and productivity, many sovereign nations over time reduced their reliance on tariffs and created new tax bases and expanded them. So the personal income tax in the United States becoming a law in, I think, 1913. So you see over time, the United States, and we were a leader, especially after World War II, we were a leader in creating the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, what's now called the World Trade Organization. It was created in the Bretton Woods Agreement, not far from here in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, for those of us in person. But under President Trump, wow, this is truly historic, taking us back decades and decades and decades for the average tariff rate. I won't go into all the academics on why tariff rates are not pro-growth and are not generally good for income distribution. The basic reason is, on growth, again, engagement with the global economy and market competition tends to induce companies to innovate. And when you give them that trade protection, it's often called, they tend to innovate less. That's just the reality of how markets and businesses work. So the best guess of the Yale Budget Lab, these are two different kind of scenarios for tariff rates, and you can look at this in more detail later if you want, but the level of total gross domestic product, total output for the United States is forecast to go down slightly, and then kind of come back up in the out years if nothing else happened. These are kind of economic models, so you kind of shock them by one thing, and you see what might happen. But notice that line is below zero in all the out years. Growth, economic output in the United States would be lower, productivity would be lower, not higher, under these sorts of tariff regimes. President Trump and others sometimes say, well, it's really going to support American manufacturing and build back American manufacturing jobs in particular. It's true that in the post-World War II decades, manufacturing jobs tended to be higher paying jobs, in large part because they were unionized jobs, and there was kind of support for workers that the unions provided in the negotiations. But the reality today is there's not many jobs in the US economy that are in manufacturing. About 160 million people will go to work in the United States today. How many will go to work in a manufacturing plant? Well, in January of 2020, or 2025 here, right before President Trump came into office, we had 12,761,000 manufacturing jobs in America. Don't worry, it's not a quiz, but how many did we have last month, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics? 11,000 fewer, 12,750. And there's no reasonable state of the world where we're going to get a lot more manufacturing jobs in any, regardless of what we might do in the time ahead. And that's because there's a lot of innovation and productivity growth in manufacturing, and all else equal, that tends to reduce employment in those industries. That's why you have so few people in the United States working in agriculture today, compared to in the founding of the Republic and over many generations. So tariffs will not be pro-productivity, pro-output growth, and importantly, all the reasonable forecasts for tariffs is they will hit harder lower-income households. This chart shows the guesstimate based on the tariffs that have been proposed of the percentage point decline in household disposable income by their income decile. The lowest income households at the first decile all the way to the highest income households at the 10th. What you see is the lower income households, these bars fall by more. They're projected to experience a bigger hit to their income in percentage terms. And the basic reason for that is what we tend to levy tariffs on are things like textiles, apparel, footwear, that are a bigger share of the budget of lower income households, and they do not have the ability to substitute towards higher expensive alternatives. Tariffs are regressive, not progressive. So that's where we will be if we continue to persist with these tariffs with the rest of the world. What about tax policy? The One Big Beautiful Bill Act, what it did was it kept in place tax cuts for individuals that were created under the 2017 Tax Cuts and Job Creation Act. So the scoring, as it's sometimes referred to in fiscal policy world, the scoring of the tax bill that is now law is relative to what would have happened if the tax cuts had been allowed to expire. So for most of this room, we will not experience any change in our personal income tax rates next year or the years beyond. The tax bill codified and made permanent, for at least the time being, the tax cuts that were created in 2017, many of which were supposed to expire at the end of this calendar year. That will, in the short term, increase economic growth. So this forecast here, shows the forecast of an increase in output in the United States, GDP, relative to baseline. Again, baseline would have been the rescission of all these, the elimination of these lower tax cuts in the past few years. So economic growth will be a little bit higher for a few years, but then over time it's projected to be lower than it would have been otherwise. And the main mechanism there, as I'll show us in a minute, is this bill, if it continues, will expand dramatically the amount of indebtedness for the United States government overall, and will raise the interest rates that the US Treasury has to pay to borrow. We'll look at that in a minute. And in terms of regressivity or progressivity, all of the analysis, because these tax cuts originally were regressive relative to the previous tax code, who benefits most from locking in these tax rates are higher income households. In fact, in particular, the change in after-tax and transfer income will be negative for the lowest two income quintiles, 40% of Americans with the lowest income. It'll be slightly positive then for the higher income households relative to eliminating those tax cuts. So this act is actually going to be something that, again, when you think about inequality in particular, is going to perpetuate whatever ongoing forces there are with inequality rather than work against it a bit. I think it's important to keep in mind the fiscal context. You might be grumpy at Washington, D.C. for this right now, but I think when we think about where we are as a sovereign nation, and again, come back to the young versus the old, we have become a fiscally profligate nation. We've been running fiscal deficits, whether it's Republicans or Democrats in the White House, for a long time, and if anything, the magnitude of those deficits continue to grow. So this picture shows from the US Congressional Budget Office, as a share of GDP, total average revenues collected by the federal government every year, total average spending by the federal government every year. And what you see is we've tended to be, over the past 50 years, we're kind of a small government country compared to others. If you look at France, a lot of the Nordic countries, instead of it being about 20% of GDP, these two lines, regardless of where they are compared to each other, would be like 40 or 50% of GDP. So we're kind of a small government nation. We're becoming one that increasingly doesn't kind of pay our bills. So over this time period, we're averaging only about 17% of GDP for the total revenues, personal income tax, the FICA Social Security tax, but we're spending about 21% every year. That difference is the fiscal deficit every year, the borrowing that Treasury undertakes on behalf of all of us. And you can see, for example, the surge in spending that happened during the pandemic. So those are the three fiscal stimulus bills in and coming out of the pandemic that ran up huge deficits. But you see in the projection in the out years is, given the laws that we have now, deficits are just going to continue to persist, and if anything, grow to an average about 6 percentage points rather than the 4. What that means, if you add up the deficits every year, and that's the debt, the total fiscal debt outstanding as a share of GDP, just continues to grow. So here's total debt outstanding as a share of GDP over the past 100+ years for the United States. Sovereign nations tend to incur large increases in indebtedness in 2 times. Existential crises of war, World War I, World War II, and perhaps less important in terms of humanity, but economic calamities. So borrowing in the FDR regime during the Great Depression, increase in indebtedness around the world financial crisis, and now again with the pandemic. But this is a projection not projecting any wars or pandemics. That's a projection simply we're an aging population, no disrespect against all of us in this room, but aging societies tend to provide more income supports for the retirees and the elderly and provide more healthcare services. And what's driving this in particular is we all age, we tend to consume more and more expensive healthcare services. Fiscally, what matters the most for these types of projections is productivity growth. You give me faster growth in productivity, you get faster growth in business and household income, you get greater taxes coming into the public purse. The one big wild card around what are the implications of President Trump's policies I mentioned a minute ago I want us to look at is this thing called AI, generative AI. And there's a big question, this is a very rigorous question potentially, is might AI generate some sort of boom in productivity growth for the United States and for other countries? And it's just kind of a cool way to summarize how fast these tools, if any of you use them, ChatGPT or Claude through Anthropic, you can get some free versions or pay a little bit. It's remarkable their ability to answer queries and provide information. And everyone in the world in almost every industry, higher ed included, we're trying to figure this out. But in terms of how fast AI is spreading, this chart shows some other technology innovations over the past 10, 15 years. And on the horizontal axis is the number of calendar days. So 500 days, 3,500 days, 10 years, a year and a half, that it took for each of these innovations to reach 1 million users and then 100 million users. And the message here is if you remember Netflix way back when, it was like you had to mail in CDs, right? Or maybe it was in VHS tapes, but you'd get Netflix, and in the mail would come another movie. And it took a long time, it took about 4 years for Netflix to get 1 million customers, and it took them about 10 years to get 100 million customers. And then what you see is Twitter, Facebook, Spotify, Instagram, these social media things faster and faster. ChatGPT, that line's almost vertical in terms of how fast it took for people to learn about this and have it have 1 million and 100 million users. Now, there's a widely divergent range of forecasts about what this might become. Some people say it's going to be economic, fountain of youth, we'll all be so productive, it'll be unbelievable in making goods and services, and we'll all be able to work 10 hours a week and be wealthy. And then at the other end, some people say it's another bubble, it's not really going to improve relative to search engines, firms aren't really going to figure out productivity gains, or in terms of the political economy, it's going to lead to this dystopia of there's going to be monitoring of people and the machines will take over. And if you ever saw the movie Terminator, it'll be like Cyberdyne Systems in the Terminator, and like humanity will be destroyed. And some people far smarter than I have pondered whether that might happen if generative AI is something that leads to machines being able to, in some sense, think for themselves. How would you define that? But there's a whole Pandora's box, I guess, of questions that arise around this. Hopefully, though, it won't be Pandora's box of trouble for humanity, but it could trigger a big productivity boom. That'd be great. So put all this together for President Trump's policies. He's made action so far on trade, on taxes. Footnote on trade, all of the proposed tariffs by the president are currently being litigated in US courts. And some of the initial lower court rulings said that all the tariffs the president has imposed are illegal because he has exceeded his statutory rights to do that. He's invoked a law that says the United States is in an emergency. And some small businesses went to court, the US International Trade Courts, and said, actually, it's not an emergency if you read the letter of that statute and the president has exceeded his bounds. And all these tariffs should be declared null and void. In the Constitution, the ability to levy border taxes, tariffs, is explicitly enshrined with the legislative branch, with Congress. Now, over time, there's been a power-sharing arrangement between presidencies and Congress in terms of who negotiates treaties, what say the White House has to negotiate treaties for tariff rates. and then what Congress can do to change those and then ratify them. So there is some chance that all of these tariffs will be nullified. I think a lot of people think it might go all the way to the US Supreme Court, so we'll see. In which case he'd have to go back to the usual way of doing it and negotiate treaties and try to get it through Congress and all that. So we'll see. But the net effect of all this, economists are bad at many things. We don't have crystal balls that are good at predicting. So let's think about a few stories for what all this might mean. So let's think about a Tigger story, a Piglet story. Piglet was kind of nervous, and an Eeyore story, like roof. So let's think of those. So what's likely to come, the implications if I put all this together, the one thing I'll say before I show us the three stories, and I put them in terms of headlines, is one thing that's very clear that the business community talks about a lot is uncertainty. So there's been a dramatic rise in uncertainty. So there's different ways that economists and policymakers measure the uncertainty facing businesses, what the CEOs and other C-suite executives say in earnings calls for publicly traded companies and so forth. But all indices of uncertainty facing American business has gone up dramatically in the past several months. And uncertainty, all else equal, tends to reduce innovation and investment. So with my friend and co-author Jonathan Haskell, I showed earlier from the productivity things from a piece I wrote with my friend David Wessel. We pointed out, if you look at the Brexit example, after Brexit was announced in the UK, businesses in the UK and others around the world were like, what does this mean? Everybody woke up that morning in June of 2016, it was like, oh my goodness. The pound fell, but everybody else said, well, what does this mean for immigration, for taxes, for trade, for investment? And what you see in the UK was an almost stagnation in capital investment by companies in the 8-9 years since, and a stagnation in overall productivity growth, and a stagnation in therefore growth in incomes. So Brexit has not brought on this massive flourishing for the UK, like some of the folks predicted. It generated massive uncertainty that has impeded a lot of innovation and ongoing growth and potential productivity. So that's something that is present for the US right now. Again, tariffs, a lot of companies are like, well, what's going to be the deal that gets negotiated? And the president might change his mind tonight or tomorrow. And by the way, it all might be nullified in US courts in the coming months. So set that aside, 3 forecasts. Let's look out 3 years. So what headlines might the Wall Street Journal write in July 30, 2028? Here's a Tigger headline. Productivity is surging, trade wars have ended, inflation is quiescent, and bipartisan comity is all around DC. How America pulled off its immaculate restoration, right? As a kid who grew up in Minnesota, like, you know, the Vikings they've lost all these Super Bowls. 2 of them, I think, were at the hands of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And the Steelers in the 1970s, Franco Harris catching that immaculate reception, the Raider fans will still dispute it, was thought to be the greatest play in NFL history. But I think people say that really sparked the surge in the Steelers' run. But anyway, this would be great. But this is all about productivity. And if generative AI is actually something that generates more equality rather than less in the labor market, there's some evidence that might, in terms of whose talents it scales, that'd be awesome. And then trade wars, for whatever mechanism it ends, and wow, it's a little bit of luck. But if innovation and productivity really were to take off because of AI, that'd be great. Okay, here's a Piglet headline. The National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER, an academic think tank that I'm lucky to be part of, but they're the ones who call U.S. recessions. They have a business cycle dating committee. NBER declares double-dip recession amidst inflation stuck at 5% because U.S. trade skirmishes and continuing at a stuck Washington. You know, we haven't had a recession yet. First quarter GDP was slightly negative. I should have looked at 8:30 this morning. The first estimate of the government for second quarter GDP was released. I didn't look. So not implausible that uncertainty and tariffs and some other shock, restricting immigration inflows would be one. We could talk about that. That's kind of a Piglet scenario. In the Eeyore scenario, in the wake of a ban on generative AI from the Protect American Workers Act and a new 50% baseline tariff, inflation hits 10%, S&P 500 tumbles to 3,000, and Fed Chair Jamie Dimon, Senate wants to know what happened. So this is a scenario where generative AI doesn't turn out to be much, or if anything, and we might want to talk about this, the churn in the labor market that might come from the job displacement from generative AI if it comes much faster than the job displacement that came over the generations from productivity growth in agriculture or in certain manufacturing jobs, if it's too fast for the political system to handle, we should not be at all surprised if there's some sort of policy backlash against that. And then you add in tariffs and whatever else, and here we are. So we can all play side bets in the break on what the odds are of this if you would like. But in the last about 10 minutes before a break, I just want us to think about what other policies the United States might pursue. Right? So here we are. It's a pretty unprecedented time in some ways. And yet I come back to President Trump has tapped into this anxiety about the American dream. He has a clear vision for how to address it, which I believe is largely not supported by academic research and history and things, and yet here we are, we're living through it. I think the question of what other policies might the United States pursue, to me, in part because of the honor of serving dean at the Tuck School, it depends on what leaders we have. So I think the right question to ask for what policies might we get is the predicate question of, well, what leaders and leadership voices might we hear to set a vision for a better America that would lead to the goals and policies as a consequence of trying to achieve that vision. So I just encourage all of us, who hit the podium in the 20th century, if I use that Nordic skiing metaphor, who told some of the most compelling leadership stories in our lifetime? Setting a vision and a goal. In the United States, FDR, absolutely, animating this case. I heard John Kennedy. I thought of John Kennedy. Yes. Here's a picture of John Kennedy delivering that speech at Rice University, September 12, 1962. He'd announced to Congress the previous year, to consternation and we're going to try to put a man on the moon. He announced other goals related to that in one of the talks you can see in the presidential library online when he first introduced that goal in Congress. But the goal that really animated America was a vision. The vision was America is going to go into space. And America is going to thrive because we are going to win the space race against the Soviet Union. There were several goals, but the most obvious and inspiring goal was we are going to put a man on the moon and return that man safely. Back then, I'm talking about men. But that was the goal. I encourage you to go back and listen to and watch this speech because of the explanation he gave for why. And it was in this speech. He said, I'm going to get it about right, but some will say, why the moon? Why set that as our goal? And he said, and they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why 35 years ago fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? And then everybody burst into laughter. It actually interrupted the cadence of his speech. So he had to say it 3 times. We choose to go to the moon. And they said, we choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. And then he gave 3 reasons. The first was not because they're easy, but because they are hard. Effort, investment. I'm editorializing. Second, he said, not because they're easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. So it's a statement of collective effort, acknowledging expertise and talent and effort. And the third reason he gave then, he said, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one that we are unwilling to postpone, and one that we intend to win, and the others too. So about making investments now, not postponing it, not delayed gratification. And in the United States, he tragically was assassinated, but the United States achieved that goal. But I think in terms of what we teach at the Tuck School and other fine business schools about leadership, it's about you have to articulate a vision for a better tomorrow and get people organized around that vision, and then you set goals and strategies around that. So when I think about policy, what's missing, I think, in our country is a unified message, a vision for what the country could be. And for a lot of people, implicitly at least, it's about what the American dream might be. The other one I want us to think about is Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping was and I want us to focus on China for a minute, because China, the economic miracle that China has experienced since the open door policies that this gentleman started in 1978 is unprecedented in world history. It was all about, in terms of the economics, realizing a dramatic acceleration in productivity growth in China that persisted for decades and decades, the fastest sustained growth in productivity any country has ever seen, let alone such a large country, and in large part because he opened to international global market forces, and they made investments in knowledge and all sorts of things along the way. Deng Xiaoping was a military general along with Mao in the Cultural Revolution. And after the Civil War ended and the nationalists fled to Taiwan, Mao came to power, but economically, it was utter chaos. There was almost no productivity growth and economic growth during Mao's regime. It was in part because they didn't do the things that we talked about earlier. The Great Leap Forward was a human tragedy, trying to build manufacturing through command and control. Tens of millions of people died. And then they had the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. Deng Xiaoping was a state enemy during the Cultural Revolution. He, I'm sure, thought he was going to die at some points. One of his sons was put in prison and then paralyzed during prison. Mao dies in December of 1976, and if there had been online betting markets, nobody would have bet that Deng Xiaoping would have come to power. But he did. And then on his first trip to the United States, yes, he had to go to the White House to see President Carter. I think it was in early 1979, 78 maybe. But it was remarkable what he did after that. He wanted to articulate a vision that China needed to grow. He knew, because he was a regional governor during the Mao regime, and he saw the poverty up close and personal. And one of the quotes that in American English that's attributed to him that he gave in some of his speeches was, "I don't care if it's a black cat or a white cat, so long as it catches mice." That was a vision of saying, we need to have faster productivity growth, and I don't really care how we get there. He came to power, and the first thing he did was he started to liberalize in agriculture. And there was an explosion in productivity growth in a couple years in agriculture. And he built the political capital to expand that to manufacturing and allow foreign companies like Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola and others to come in and start to establish and expand business operations, to learn and get all that innovation and stuff from the rest of the world. And he came to the United States, and he didn't just go to the White House. He wanted to communicate that vision about openness to innovation and productivity. On that trip, he then went to Atlanta, Georgia. He visited Coca-Cola. He went to Houston, Texas. He went to the Johnson Space Center because he wanted it. What was the most technologically advanced thing the world had ever seen at that point in terms of innovation? The United States putting someone on the moon and returning them safely. Went to the Johnson Space Center. Went to a rodeo when he was there. In this famous picture, they gave him a hat, and he was like, oh, hey. And then to get home, because he couldn't fly nonstop from Houston, they stopped in Seattle to refuel, but he also stopped in Seattle at the Boeing plant. Because the other most amazing technology innovative thing at that time was Boeing created the 747 aircraft and went and toured that production facility. So what he unleashed in terms of set aside what are today, I think, very harrowing concerns about human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, the economics that vision that he articulated was remarkable. And his today's successor, President Xi, is very clear about wanting the 21st century to be the Chinese century. He talks about the Chinese dream, and he's very clear in saying, I want the global economic system to not be made and continue in the vision and leadership of the United States, but in the leadership of China. Under his leadership, he articulated very clear goals, made in China 2025, to build manufacturing capacity in the industries of the future, of electric vehicles and a bunch of other high-tech manufacturing and technology-related things. And not unreasonably, people in the West, they rue and say this is unfair competition, too much subsidies. That's likely true in a lot of cases. But again, every sovereign government makes some public investments to support productivity growth and innovation. And at some level, it doesn't matter because the outcome of this has been dramatic. He's been trying to build trade and investment and immigration connections, mainly trade and investment. China's pretty closed on immigration, with scores of nations all over the world through the Belt and Road Initiative. The United States, under President Trump and then President Biden, we refused to join one of the world's biggest trade agreements that we've been negotiating with a bunch of Asia-Pacific countries in particular. It's called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. China stepped in and said, you know what, we'll take the lead. And they put together a differently named trade agreement that they're trying to expand. And today, it's remarkable. Like electric vehicles, the world's most innovative EV company is not Tesla, and it's not Rivian, it's BYD. Build your dreams. It is a Chinese-based multinational, and it's remarkable the innovation and the quality of their products. It's just stunning. It is very clear, like it or not, and again, I'm setting aside the legitimate and in many ways more important concerns about human rights, about freedom of speech, about freedom of assembly. But it is very clear some sovereign nations, when you think about the public policy, have leaders that articulate a vision. So it's time to take a break. I'll just leave us maybe with, well, who might step up in the United States? So let's think about our political parties. Who on the Democratic side? I think the three that people are most excited about, perhaps, not unreasonably perhaps, it's AOC, Representative AOC, Senator Bernie Sanders. They've been on a Fight Oligarchy tour. Again, their message is the problem of the faded American dream is rapacious companies and oligarchs. This gentleman who may end up being the, Madmani, who may end up being the new mayor of New York City, who shocked a lot of people winning the primary over former Governor Cuomo, has talked about implicitly things of the faded American dream. We're going to freeze rent rates in Manhattan, free childcare, free busing. Hear that as we're going to lower the cost of certain goods and services to raise your standard of living. I think the economics on policy proposals like that are very worrisome, but here we are. And on the Republican side, you got J.D. Vance, you have Senator Rubio, or now Secretary Rubio. Right? And again, they have a vision that is very much consistent with the president's of building walls. I'll use that broad metaphor. My last slide before we take a break. If you ask me what to do, maybe we can talk about this. I think it's very clear people have legitimate concerns about the fading or faded American dream for some. But it's very clear, research I and others have done, Americans don't want us to build walls. What they want is they want more, they get the benefits of global engagement. They just want to have a fair shot at it. And we're not doing enough to build what economists call human capital. A lot of people say the game is kind of rigged. And I just don't have a good shot, and my kids and my neighbors don't have a good shot at living that American dream. People want the dignity of work, and they want to have a sense that they're getting the tools and possibility to engage in the global economy. Think of sports. People love the globalization of the NBA and the National Hockey League and other sports like that. They get and want to have a chance just to thrive in that global competition. But thriving means, in terms of the economics, building their human capital. So my friend Ken Sheevy and I we've written a lot on this over the years. We said rebuild this ladder of opportunity. That's, I believe, the only sustainable way to really rebuild the American dream. Building walls won't do it. Price interventions that, rather than expand innovation and supply, just muck it up, those don't work. So we can talk maybe after the break about how we might address all this. But I really appreciate everyone's attention so far, and I really look forward to the discussion and the questions. So thanks.
You are terrific. We are about to begin a brief intermission. Last about 25-30 minutes. Come back at 10:30, please. At this time, please turn in any questions on your index cards or in the chat window online. For those here at the Opera House, your index card should be dropped into the baskets at the front and back of the theater. And please submit your questions as quickly as you can, because we'll start organizing them in a few minutes. See you back here in a few minutes. Bye-bye. you're still mic'd.
Yes.
Well, the Q&A period will last 3 hours.
Oh, okay. All right, I'm buying 3 tomatoes for everyone.
And I wish many of you had. And I wish that many of you had paid more attention to your penmanship when you were in school.
My wife says that all the time. I have chicken scratch.
Having just returned from China, the same dynamics seem to be present regarding their dream. Youth are very discouraged, as are their parents, about improved living conditions and opportunities. Resentment seem present, income inequality, high costs. What might these dynamics mean to the government? I have concern that the regime could use war over Taiwan to divert popular discontent. Please comment.
Yeah, that could be an hour. So great question. So yes, the challenge for the Chinese leadership and the Chinese people in the framework we talked about this morning is productivity growth and overall economic growth has slowed dramatically. There were some years where productivity growth, output per worker in China across all the industries, was growing at close to 10% a year. Yeah, so like that chart I showed is like the red line way up there. So, but over a period from, again, the open door reforms in eggs starting in 1978 until last year, it probably has averaged, say, about 6% a year. But it's slowing a lot in recent years. Now, why is that happening? One is all the opening to the rest of the world of international trade investment that allowed China to become the manufacturing powerhouse. Under President Xi, he's closing that up a lot. He did it purposely during the pandemic for health reasons or other political reasons. But it's become, China is much less open to more trade and investment, in particular international investment. So if you look at the global companies that established and expanded operations in China over the many decades, part of what accelerated their productivity growth, they're all curtailing to dialing back to closing their operations. And the other challenge they face is it's a rapidly aging population. On most demography measures, China is one of the most rapidly aging countries on the planet, second or third to Korea and Japan. And that's just a consequence of the one-child policy. You just roll that through the actuarial tables for decades, and they've tried to policy. They now have incentives for. I think just yesterday they announced $500 per child that's born in China, but it's not happening. So the young, they see slower growth. They see less opportunity to connect with the world. There's almost no people no immigrants who come into China. It's almost virtually closed to any immigration, unlike the U.S. So it's a challenge. And so President Xi hopes, I think, that their advances in these high technology industries like automobiles and batteries and all that kind of stuff will be enough. And time will tell.
All right, switching gears. How does the greatest challenge to global future, climate change, feed into our economic future, especially productivity and narrowing the income gap?
Yeah, so the planet continues to warm, and in no small part because of continued human-created CO2 emissions. That hasn't changed. I think the United States has said to the rest of the world, we're not interested. And so one problem that creates is a real sticking point, I think, for the past 10, 20 years on efforts to have a global regime to address climate change was a lot of the emerging markets, not unreasonably said to the advanced countries, well, the stock of most of the CO2 pollutants in the atmosphere you guys created over centuries, a couple centuries, and now you're asking us to bear a lot of the costs of not being able to burn oil and dirty coal as we grow and we try to accelerate productivity. So could we just have some sort of international transfer? You guys pay for us to kind of make some of these climate adjustments because we're so poor, low productivity level, we can't afford it. And everybody talked about it, and nothing ever really happened. And with the United States not involved in these talks, nothing will happen in the years ahead. And I think the other reality is because the Cold War chills between the United States and China, the two biggest CO2 emitters are the US and China. So basically, it's awesome when smaller nations want to play their part, but in terms of the physics, it becomes de minimis. So if you cared, Gordon Hanson, a co-author, friend of mine, we wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs a few years ago. If you care enough about global warming and climate change, per our discussion, you should have a global policy regime to have open trade, investment, immigration, and clean tech to try to actually scale all of these innovations and provide more incentive to innovate. And sovereign nations are doing the exact opposite, right? BYD and these Chinese electric vehicles are much cleaner than the ones that burn on gasoline. And the United States has 100% tariffs that President, I think, Biden implemented and Trump has continued. Almost every European nation is levying these same tariffs of almost similar magnitude. So instead of allowing that technology to spread and provide competition for US firms, we're building walls. So, again, I'm a taker, but there's just clear consequences to not having a clear vision and set of goals around these issues.
Lori at the Ollie at UVA says, how much will our productivity be hampered by deporting the workers we rely on?
Economic growth will slow. And every human being, I think, has the same inherent dignity and value. In terms of the productivity implications, in the near term, what will matter more is highly educated immigrants. And so I think that remains to be seen. There's a lot of consternation among international students and internationals of high talent, of their desire to come to the United States and study and or work here. So this is a potentially gravely important issue for business schools and other schools in higher education. Part of what enriches Anne's a terrific Tuck alum, class of 79? 77, sorry. Your class was almost predominantly domestics, probably, right? US born. Few Japanese. Back then, globalization was Japan, right? The surge in Japan was a high productivity growth country. So if you look at the Tuck photos on the walls of every graduating class in Tuck Hall, what you see is internationals, many people who looked Japanese, and it's because Japan was a high productivity growth, high innovation country. And so they went out into the world. Fast forward today, in recent years, about a third of each MBA class at Tuck is international, third. And they come here to match into the American labor market and broader society. So if we restrict that, again, economists don't know a lot. High talent immigrants are a massive boon to innovation. They're more likely to create patents of value. They're more likely to found companies and help scale companies than native-born Americans. The factoid you hear, approximately half of the Fortune 500 companies today were founded initially by an immigrant or the child of an immigrant.
We're wandering a little from your talk, but how might the disruption in the federal workforce brought on by DOGE, along with administrative policy to reduce the size of the federal government, how might that play out in the economy?
Yeah, I think there's a narrow and a bigger issue. I think the narrow issue is all else equal, it's jobs being destroyed, so that tends to slow labor force growth. And I don't think, there's only about a little over 2 million Americans that work for the federal government. State and local government's much bigger because it's public school teachers, firefighters, all that. So the numbers relative to the size of the labor force are not all that big. That's my first thought. But my second thought, and I acknowledge this is personal, I know my wife and I, and probably many in this room, have friends, if not family, who have been deeply affected by this, laid off, the threats of layoffs. And I'll come back to, in our framework today, part of what has allowed the United States to thrive and become a high productivity nation, our growth is slowed, but we're still in levels pretty high, is having a public infrastructure that allows there to be trust among firms and citizens in the public policies. We have believed, I think most of us, there's fair, transparent ways that taxes are levied and audited. We believe that we've got civil servants in different agencies that are going to pursue goals of competitive markets and all that. So you take away some of the most talented people in these agencies and you make the appointees much more political, the research is very clear that that impedes economic growth. Daron Acemoglu, who just won the Nobel Prize in Economics this past year, last fall, along with Simon Johnson and Jim Anderson, his co-author in Chicago, wrote a lot about this, looking at countries. Those that build trust-based institutions tend to have better economic performance. So we're moving in the wrong direction on that.
For independence from erratic U.S. tariffs, the BRICS Plus group of 10 nations, home to nearly half the world's people, is negotiating a free trade deal with the energy-rich Gulf Cooperation Council countries. What now?
What?
What now?
Oh, well, frankly, good on them. I think I love being an American, but it's hubris for us to think that the other 96% of the people of the world are going to sit around and wait for us to see if we want to be leaders again in the global economy. So I think they recognize the benefits it generates, and above and beyond that, I think just the cultural ties and things that get built. Again, I come back to leadership. You can imagine leaders coming up in the United States who would say, no, we got to have a better way to engage with the world so more people have a shot at it. People don't want walls. They want us to build more. If we look at the public opinion evidence, they do not want us to build walls. But they don't want unfettered bridges to the rest of the world. That makes them worried also, because globalization does not benefit every single worker and firm and community. What people want is building more bridges to the world, but providing really robust ladders of opportunity so more people can kind of get up on those bridges and mix it up with the world.
Here's an equity question. Could we adopt a policy where the CEO of a company cannot earn more than 10% of the lowest paid employees?
So we could.
That would hit your admissions.
Yeah, not sure that will drive up admissions to the MBA program at Tuck and other great programs. No, but more realistically, I think I come back to what I said about rent control. Price controls generally don't work. So without judgment, I believe that the innovativeness of compensation committees and boards of directors in terms of what kind of compensation they'll provide to people, that's hard. And I have colleagues at Tuck and Tax and other things that could explain it much better than I. I think the related thing is, again, to me, it's what fiscal regime do we want to build that is a just fiscal regime? What kind of tax system do we want to have? The top marginal income tax rate in the United States today is 37%. For several years under President Eisenhower and President Kennedy, the top marginal income tax rate was 91%. Am I right, Richard? 91? Thank you. And that was a high productivity growth, high income growth, high innovation time in the American economy. It's a canard to say everywhere and always, every single tax, if you raise the tax rate, it destroys innovation and growth and so on. That's just not true.
Bruce at the Alley at UMass asks, what are your thoughts on the Stable Coins Act?
It's a little beyond my knowledge. I don't know. I don't know the specifics of the act. I will say the following. Money exists in history. Money is an asset that has three different combinations of what it does. It's either a unit of account, it's a store of value, and it's a medium of exchange. To date, all the empirical evidence is that stable coins and other cryptocurrencies fail don't meet any of those three criteria. A lot of the economic activity that cryptocurrencies facilitate, economic activity, not as a speculative asset. The economic activity is in most countries in the world illicit, illegal activity. narco trafficking, human trafficking. That's thought one. Thought two, more generally, remember, cryptocurrencies were created in the immediate aftermath of the world financial crisis. So this might be too much of a connecting the dots. People don't know who's the individual. There's a paper was written to explain why cryptocurrencies should be created. But the basic argument was we cannot trust sovereign governments. Right? Sovereign governments should not have the monopoly power of creating money. So we're going to take that out of the hands of corrupt, untrustworthy sovereign governments, and we, the people around the world, will create currencies. So that to me is a symptom of the broad issue we've been talking about here. If within and across countries, people don't trust in their leaders, their elected leaders, and they don't believe that they're, in our lexicon, creating the American dream, not unreasonably, people will look for alternatives. So.
Lots of AI questions. AI competitors now spend billions to gain market share and invest in data centers and power. Winners must be near ample, reliable, cheap energy sources, such as Texas natural gas or demothballed nuclear power plants. Will U.S. regulator gauntlets stop needed energy projects?
If you ask me to make a prediction, I think the answer is no. The White House, earlier this week, I believe, or late last week, put out some sort of AI policy statement, which is we aspire to be the leading sovereign nation on AI. And it's very energy intensive, given how it currently works, because you have to have like a gazillion, beyond what I know as a poet, not a quant, a gazillion computer chips of high-performing capabilities in data centers, and those require a lot of energy to fuel the gazillion calculations that AI models do to learn and or to implement the queries that we put into them. And it takes a lot of water also and energy to cool them, because right now these things, they just generate a lot of physical heat.
A couple more. An easy one. How long until AI makes money? And what percentage of manufacturing and distribution jobs are expected to be eliminated by AI and robotics?
Yeah. On the first, it depends on who you are. Like if you're Jerry Wang, one of the co-founders of NVIDIA, you made a lot of money, right? Because last week, the total market capitalization of NVIDIA, this company that makes the main computer chips that run these models best, the total market cap hit $4 trillion. So there's wealth being created around this. I think, but what I hear in the question is connected with the second one is, but for all of us, when we think about productivity for the United States, for higher education and healthcare and housing and just down the line, will generative AI actually make firms more productive? So I think one useful way to think about it is most occupations, most jobs, there's a bundle of tasks that we do. And most technology innovations, especially these computing-related ones of the past 50 years, they tend to automate a bunch of tasks that we used to use have our brains do, or slide rules, or whatever, right? So calculators get created, and for better or for worse, we all don't have to do long division or do it on a slide rule. So the world's trying to figure out what tasks that workers currently do in different organizations can be automated by generative AI. And that's a big open question. Some people say it's going to be a lot. Some people are going to say, a few. And like we at Tuck, we're trying to figure it out. Our awesome Tuck faculty, I think every single faculty member now is using generative AI in different ways. Many of us now have, you can create these bots. You train it on a certain set of content. So a lot of us take our course materials, or if it's an elective, the core classes, and put it in a bot. So for my elective, that LGE, students then come talk to me, but if they want to, what did we learn in the core global economics class about exchange rates or infant industries, they can go look at all that stuff and query it. So that makes you more efficient at that task rather than going looking at your notes and that kind of thing. So the worry is a lot of tasks are going to be automated very quickly, and a lot of jobs will be gone very quickly. That was my Eeyore-like thing. Some people are sounding alarm bells to say it is going to come so quickly to so many occupations, and then in the short term at least, you won't need as many workers if a lot of those tasks get automated. That's sort of that's the classic issue with any productivity growth from innovation, from a political economy sense, is how quickly are tasks automated and jobs changed or jobs lost, but how quickly can those individuals find new jobs? And I think about ag. In 1900, about 40% of Americans worked in agriculture. 40% of Americans. Today, it's only 1.5%. Right. But we didn't have revolution in this country on all that because that transition happened over the 125 years. So it was slow enough for the policy process and people to move literally off the farms to cities and so on and so forth. So technology innovations that come too quickly for the political system's ability to absorb those transitions, that's a question, always.
Lori at UVA says, we used to learn that debt owed to ourselves was good when we're talking about federal debt. Assess the long-term impact of federal deficits, and are they necessarily bad?
Yeah. Sorry, can we put up the slides again? It's a great question, but I don't mean to be, if not, that's fine. Yeah. So, here we go. I don't mean to quibble or be pedantic. To me, the primary question of fiscal borrowing is, for what are you borrowing? Are you borrowing for, broadly speaking, investments or consumption? Like us as individuals, right? People, and so I think over much of this figure up here, the United States was borrowing during existential times in the earlier, over most of the 20th century. Right? We needed to borrow from domestic savers, savings bonds and stuff, and from the rest of the world to win World War II. And then we pay that back through different mechanisms. We ran surpluses. There's a little bit of inflation that inflated away part of the debt in that decline. And I'm not saying this was bad if I look at the most recent borrowing up there, but I just want us to understand the trade-offs. So the surge in indebtedness in the last few years around COVID, those were 3 fiscal bills that each added, by the CBO's guesstimate, about $2 trillion each. So $6 trillion in new total indebtedness during in and around the pandemic. And I don't want to sound mean, but it was largely to facilitate ongoing consumption by a lot of households. And that I realize that sounds heartless. So I'm not saying that wasn't bad, but we're not now paying that back. We're running deficits at 6% of GDP for the foreseeable future. So the federal spending, if you look at the composition of federal spending, federal research and development as a share of GDP. So the amount of this spending every year that used to go to investing in ideas, NASA and DARPA and all these things that created fundamental knowledge that firms drew on and stuff like that. It hit during some of the Kennedy years about 2.5% of GDP. This fiscal year, it's about 1/10 of that. It's about 0.3% of GDP. So I think that it's a great question about indebtedness, but I think that the key question is why are we borrowing, and what's the prospects for paying it back? And let's be clear, this is mainly an issue of intergenerational equity or absence thereof. Most of us in this room are benefiting from this borrowing in direct and indirect ways, and will be out of the labor force or not here when Alex, who seems to be the one millennial here, Alex, thank you for being very productive to pay all this back. But I'm only half kidding, right? Look at the surveys of the young. Do you expect to have Social Security when you retire? Large majorities of young Americans in recent years say no. So.
We'll pop back to AI again in this next question from Jill, who was online. In the suggested readings, free community college was discussed. Do you think community colleges will be able to develop an AI program quickly in order to make sure that students are equipped for jobs of the future?
Great question. So one of the second of the third rungs that Ken and I wrote about was making community college free for any young adult who doesn't go to a four-year college in America. A lot of the research shows the barriers to completing community college are not enough income to pay for yourself for the kind of 2-ish years you're in it. And it's modest amounts, but it's these shocks to your income that get people to oftentimes not finish those programs. A couple flat tires, I don't have the $500. I'm going to stop this class, and then people would trid out. So it's a great question about whether community colleges might be loci of figuring out skills related to AI. It'd be awesome if it was, because the thriving community colleges in America, they're ones that have close partnerships with key businesses in the area. And those key businesses are working closely with the faculty and staff of these community colleges to say, here's the skills that we need today and in the coming year or two. And you got to worry about, rightly, okay, but are they going to underpay the young adults when they get there? But that's addressable through the market. And just if businesses, whether it's on AI or anything else, are helping teach what seem to be the emerging skills they need, that'd be awesome. Right? Because higher ed, for better or worse, four-year colleges and universities don't tend to have that trades-focused of learning. So it would be great.
We've gotten through about a quarter of the questions, and we still have this many to go, but our time is closing down. So
we have till 11:30, no?
Ooh. Yeah, we do.
I'll talk faster, too.
There must be the ghost of last week's moderator, because she ended half an hour too soon.
Oh.
Okay. Forget the numbers. What impact do Trump's trade policies have on America's role in global leadership and international cooperation?
It corrodes our leadership. It corrodes our leadership. We are less, sovereign nations anthropomorphized trust us less. They see us as a less reliable partner. And they're, per the good question earlier about the Asia trade agreement, they're saying, okay, look at, as many of these countries are negotiating with the US to try to strike some sort of deal, they're rapidly restarting and accelerating trade investment negotiations among themselves, with the US being excluded.
Wendy at the University of Michigan asks, what are the implications to education regarding ways to increase America's creativity, which will in turn make us more innovative and productive?
Not to keep flogging this, but it's the first, I think the biggest private and social return is early childhood education for every single American child. Now, it's hard to know what exactly to do because the research is, but there's some emerging research in recent years by amazing folks like Nobel laureate Jim Heckman at Chicago. The interventions that work, the private and social returns are like lifetime in community. And it seems to be things like the number of unique words that a child hears by the time they turn 5, by being read to and stuff. And tragically, there's a lot of hardworking parents and other caregivers in some families, given the economic stuff we talked about, they don't have the time to do that. Like, I'm only half kidding. We should have like a Marshall Plan that respects the dignity of all these families, but does it by saying, you are a child in America, and regardless of what circumstance in which you were born, we are going to give you all this stuff early on executive function and all this kind of stuff, so that by the time they get to school, the inequalities that exist in our country by the time kids are 6 or 10 are dramatic. And then they just continue to, it seems, to expand. So that would be a great thing to do. Now, that clock ticks decade by decade, but like we got to get going on this, you know what I mean? There's other things we can do at other levels too, like the community college idea is a great one, right? If there's ways, and you can imagine public investment, somebody paying a little bit more in taxes to fund these types of things and get these sorts of pilots going and stuff. So, I realize a lot of these answers are like Piglet to Eeyore, but I'm only half kidding on young adults like Alex or any of us, regardless of our age. This is a great time to try to be a leader. Like we say this at Tuck, like the returns to being a leader now are much, much higher. because of the yearning that a lot of people have for vision and leadership.
Steve at UVA says, the U.S. economy grew at a rate of 3% in the second quarter. Does this lend credence to Trump's economic policy?
Yeah, great question. And not to nitpick, but we in our core course at Tuck, that's an annualized rate of growth. So if it grew at that rate for 12 months, it would have been 3% total. Within the quarter, it was then about 6 or 7/10 of a percent. No, I think what it speaks to is, somebody asked this question here, about 2/3 of the US economy is consumption spending. And so when you look at a high frequency of quarter by quarter, that variation is mainly driven by what households do in terms of consumption spending. And despite all the uncertainty I talked about, we're close to full employment. Income growth is slower than we would like because of slow productivity growth, but it's growing a little bit. And so most consumption spending has to do with, do I have a job and is it paying okay? And then high-end consumer spending, that's the other kind of chunk of it. Well, as we talked, kind of high net worth, high income households are generally, there might be, whether they're thrilled or concerned a lot about what's happening in the United States and the world, they're still consuming. So.
Another question from UVA. Theoretically, real wage growth should track closely with productivity growth. Why has that not happened over the last 50 years?
Yeah, so I think, not to quibble, it's a great question, but I showed it earlier. The reason we have this figure of unequal growth in incomes is there's no law of physics or law of economics that says a given level of total productivity growth maps equally into all skill levels. The case in the post-World War II generation of kind of 45 to 73, in part because the public sector was still doing a ton to broaden access to skills. So more people were participating in that. And we were still doing a good job of innovating in primary and secondary education. But as I said, not to repeat myself, this diffusion of growth at the very high end, the research shows very clearly it's the scalability of talent through some combination of globalization and technological change. And so the opening of the global economy, China, India, fall of the Berlin Wall is part of what explains this, the scalability of capital, of finance, occupations and consultancies and athletes. And that's why the difference.
Mary at the University of Michigan asks you to address challenges to building human capital and leadership in the U.S., given recent restrictions on realistic youth education in facts and critical thinking tools.
Okay, we're done. I don't know the answer to the question, meaning here's how I think about it. Part of what Ken and I were thinking about on this lifelong ladder of opportunity thing was you see test scores for young adults in America, like 4th grade, 8th grade, I think it's 11th grade, there's something that the OECD calls called PISA, the Program on International Student Assessment. And every 2 or 3 years, they have a pretty well done kind of reading, math, science, I think it is, test of young adults in dozens of countries. And the United States scores in an absolute level have been flat to falling on average. Beneath that average, when they dig into it, because they can dig into where kids are, but they know kind of what schools they're at, and that's a good proxy for socioeconomic access. Higher wealth, higher income community kids are doing better, there's a little bit of growth. So beneath that, there's this inequality of the basic learning skills that's happening. And because part of what determines productivity and income distribution is how we're doing relative to other countries. You see these other countries that are taking off. You know, Shanghai, Greater Shanghai in China in recent years scores about at the level of Norway and these other countries that are among the highest, Finland. So that's, to me, the answer to Mary's good question is the answer to that. What is it about our primary and secondary schools that our students seem to not be advancing their learning? And people on Different sides of the American political aisle will give radically different answers. And so that's a much broader conversation. I think clearly one of the things that was not well done in the pandemic was closing down public schools and not reopening them early enough. And I will say, in most parts of the country, teachers' unions were vocal on that, and the damage that has caused to the young is already clear. And if we had looked more at some of the research and what happens in war in other countries, the research shows oftentimes the lost learning persists for years to decades. So like, we don't have a time machine, but like, again, part of the vision, we've got to find a way to think about what education is about that we don't have. It's kind of interesting, like at the federal level, well, part of education is being dismantled, but in some ways, we seem to not have, there was a time in the Obama administration stuff, we talked a lot about our schools, and now nobody's talking about it. It's hyperbole, but not by much. You know, we had Race to the Top, I think it was called, Secretary Duncan under President Obama, and No Child Left Behind under President Bush 43. But with you know, those were bipartisan efforts, and you know, if I recall correctly, it was President Bush, and in the Senate, Senator Ted Kennedy was a big supporter of No Child Left Behind. Someone would have to fact check that, but we're not having those conversations at the federal level right now. And so it's at the local levels I get, but there's just a lot of variation at local levels in terms of what we teach.
Switching back, how do you factor in rising energy costs in order to increase productivity? What are the environmental implications of Trump's economic policies?
Great question. If I set aside the legitimate and growing environmental concerns about what kind of energy we produce, I just want to focus on the economics for a moment. The energy revolution in America has been terrific for productivity growth. The fact that we now have an inflation-adjusted term that has stabilized the price of petroleum-based energy in the United States that nobody was foreseeing in the early 2000s. So that's been a boon to productivity, actually. It hasn't shown up in the aggregate, but take that away, higher energy costs would have probably made productivity in the United States grow even more slowly. So.
Talk about the American dream. It's affected by lack of influence from by the average American, and this questioner is pointing to the electoral college and Citizens United.
It is clear the amount of time and energy our elected officials spend on fundraising is so different from any other country in the world that has a democracy and carries a clear cost. And to me, one of the biggest costs is, if I focus on our legislators in Washington, D.C., how it literally eats away the time they spend together legislating. Now, many members, it's the reality that they face, but they spend half-ish of each week fundraising. There's a reason, if you look, a lot of the votes in the House and Senate happen on Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. Many members will return Monday evening and will fly out Thursday evening to be back in their districts. Sometimes, I'm not being, that's great, but it's oftentimes fundraising. In the next year's typical Senate campaign in the United States, each candidate will have, in direct and indirect ways, it's going to be tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars. But the cost it creates for, the opportunity cost, as we economists call it, is less time getting to know people within your caucus, let alone across the aisle, and spending time together and doing what I consider to be the output of the legislative branch, which is legislating, introducing bills, convening hearings, bringing in experts from the rest of the world to testify and talk with the members and their staff about the legislation, convene markups, have more hearings, vote it out of committee, bring it to the full floor, have more debate and discussion, have a vote. Like, it's remarkable, if you believe, as I do, that's the output by design that our legislators should be doing. The amount of legislating that our leaders do is shockingly little like the measures of hearings and bills. And so I think that's one of the costs of how we fund our federal elections. That worries me a lot.
Isn't Trump's American dream a white American dream of the 1950s? I said we needed penmanship. Something, position in the world, neither equity nor equality figure into Trump's American dream.
I'm going to largely pass on that one. I will observe part of how Trump outperformed relative to his performance in 2016 was more people who self-identify as black, more people who self-identify as Hispanic, believe Native American, voted for Donald Trump than they did earlier times. So, yep. Inequalities across gender and race continue to be large and persistent in the United States. That's very clear.
I'm trying to find legible questions. With U.S. markets at hugely elevated levels and regression to the mean, tell us your concern on huge 30 to 50% drops on the market, U.S.
So it's a question about U.S. stock prices?
Yes.
Great question. I mean, these are all great questions. Stock prices, they go up and down. They generally go up over time to compensate for their riskier investments than bonds and other safer assets. We experienced peak to trough, depending on which of the major markets you looked at, from Liberation Day announcement to shortly after April 9 or 10, when Secretary of Treasury Bassett and President Trump said, oh, well, we're going to pause a lot of this. Around the time, peak to trough, I'd have to go look, but the NASDAQ, I think, fell by over 20%. Now it's built all that back. So I don't mean to discount that, but so to me, it's not that high frequency volatility. My Eeyore thing about Dow at whatever I put up there, S&P at 3,000, it's at, I don't know, 6,300 today, was more, you give me a period of really slow and poor productivity growth. One of the manifestations in lots of countries is little to no growth in equity prices. So I think in the United States, I'd have to fact check this, but from summer of 1966 until August of 1982, the cumulative, at least real return, inflation-adjusted return on US stocks was 0. You have long periods where stock prices don't grow a lot. It tends to be periods of low innovation and productivity growth. And then the equity bull market took off in 82.
John Kemeny, a former Dartmouth president, worked a year on the Manhattan Project before he graduated from Princeton. Economic productivity is improved by competition between nations, between companies. Can we create competitive year-long internship programs attractive to students?
Sure. I'm ready to vote for that individual who wrote that question. If you handed me the magic wand, I could see the merits, and it's complicated to figure out. Again, my friendly amendment would be rather than competitive, I'd say mandatory. We have no mandatory national public service in this country. And who tends to do it are the high net worth, high income families. So, but I think something that, whether it's public service or just gap years before college, that kind of thing, like amazing. Take young adults, have them move somewhere else in the country, have to spend time not on their screens with other young adults to talk through things. Now, again, that's expensive, but we borrow a lot for a lot of things. Something like that, I'd have, that wouldn't be very much on these figures. I don't know. So.
How important is it that the Federal Reserve remain independent?
Very. The historic record is very clear. Nations where the fiscal authority meddles in the business of the monetary authority tend to be slower productivity growth, higher average inflation, and higher volatility of inflation countries.
Bangladesh will pay Russia in yuan for a new nuclear power plant. Is Russia becoming a vassal of China? Is the ruble collapsing?
I'm not an expert on, great question, on these national security issues. I'll pull out a piece of it. I don't know the value of the ruble, and not that you're asking this, but some people, on the point about some transaction happening denominated in Chinese yuan, some people look and say, goodness gracious, like the hegemony in the global financial system of the US dollar is ending. I think those fears are overblown because demand for currencies is always relative. So if you want to tell me that there's no law that says what the world's reserve currency is going to be, it's kind of the collective judgment of savers and investors around the world for what currency they'd like to denominate a lot of their economic transactions in. And the United States, to come back to some of these earlier good questions, built the trust broadly of the rest of the world such that the hegemony of the dollar emerged, where the large majority of international trade transactions of goods and services are denominated in dollars. And I'm not going to get the facts right because the data is a little sketchy because there's not some omniscient data collection thing. But most foreign currency transactions in the world today, the dollar's on the other side of like 90% of those transactions. It's selling yuan for dollars or buying British pounds for dollars. It's not pounds for yuan or something else. So I'm a Tigger. I don't worry that like there's going to be this collapse in the dollar tomorrow or something, because it's like, well, who's going to, the Chinese yuan, China has massive controls on the inflows and outflows of capital, so it's not a useful asset in which to denominate a lot of international transactions.
A century of globalization has made the U.S. economy dependent on imports and exports to other countries. Isn't China more self-dependent, able to progress with its own resources and talents despite isolating trade barriers being erected by others?
Not to quibble, but actually unusual measures of how open a country is. One of the main measures economists use is total value of exports and imports as a share of total output. China is much more open than the United States is, actually. They just do a lot more exporting of stuff they produce and importing of other stuff than the United States does. So I think that, to me, the difference about China versus the United States comes back to talking about the visions and dreams, right? China has been making clear investments in its infrastructure and certain industries, and again, some of that is unfair legitimately in the eyes of how we've set the international trade rules and things, but they're doing it, and again, the United States we're different, so.
Is universal basic income a viable way of solving the freedom from want issue?
I don't want this to sound cold-hearted. I think the answer that I would give is largely no. And the reason is, and this comes back to some of the research I did with my friend Ken in this commission I served on for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences a couple years ago. Most people, they deeply want the dignity of work. Most people want to have a sense of, I'm eudaimonia. I go all the way back to the American dream. I have some talents and interests, and I am bringing that into, yes, the private labor markets, but more generally into society. And so I firmly believe we have it in certain versions, right? Social Security, disability income. There definitely, I think, a just nation needs to provide income for those who, I think, truly cannot and cannot work in some sense. And we all reach that age too, absolutely. But I think for most people who want to engage and have the American dream more real, for many of them, it is actually centered around dignified work. It's very clear in surveys and public opinion, just polls and focus groups that you can read about.
A couple of questions. What do you recommend? What changes do you suggest to improve U.S. productivity? What tax, social safety net, and regulatory policies would you favor to reduce income and wealth inequality?
I don't have that many thoughts, so you know what I mean. I come back to this of having a vision for America to build human capital so everybody has a better shot. People value equality of opportunity, not so much equality of outcomes. And we have very unequal opportunity in this country right now. And so that would be part of it. I think to pay for it, if I showed us the fiscal slides again, it's a canard to think there's enough there of taxing just the 1%ers to pay for all this. You look at the IRS puts in the public domain the statistics of income tables, and I often ask my students if we do stuff on this, go look at what's the total taxable AGI of 1% households. It's nowhere near enough to address the magnitude of our deficits and if we want to pay down some of this debt. So it'd be great if we recognize as a sovereign nation, taxes are can't think of the Supreme Court justice. It's the privilege we pay for society, as opposed to, you're a job killer. I think if I wave the magic wand, marginal income tax rates, starting at about the median and above, should be raised. Ken and I wrote something earlier, many years ago. The FICA tax is very regressive because it's a flat rate on a largely capped base. We proposed a tax cut so people thought globalization worked for them. Eliminate the FICA tax for everybody below the median income, household income, and then just make it more progressive on the people above the median. It's stuff like that would make this more fiscally sustainable. Yeah.
Back to Economics 101.
Love it.
Why, in light of public despair about the demise of the American dream, do you not mention neoliberalism as preached by Milton Friedman of the University of Chicago and his Chicago boys? This has led to the transfer of the fruits of the economy from the middle and lower income fractiles to the top 1%, abetted by the Supreme Court, allowing unrestricted money to electoral, I can't say that word, policy and enforcement of antitrust policy. The already wealthy have spawned an oligarchic billionaire class as the unwealthy have lost all hope and turned to MAGA.
Okay, so we talked about money in politics. What most Americans want is a fair shot at whatever it means for them to work and thrive in the global economy. People value much more equality of opportunity, I will say this again, than equality of outcomes. And I'm not being oppositional, but the inequality of income that we saw and the unequal wealth distribution, sometimes people, they use the metaphor and they sometimes mean it literally. The wealth or income was taken from modest to less skilled workers and somehow allocated to higher income, higher wealth individuals. That's not what happens. What happens, though, is the market forces, as we talked about, the scalability of talent, in particular, over the past 30, 40, 50 years, has allowed some people's incomes and wealth to grow dramatically, and others haven't. So I hear you on the, what do you call it, the Chicago boys of University of Chicago. I think I would translate to say, we can't be indifferent. Markets generally work. They don't always work. Markets are a great aggregator of preferences and allocation of resources. But we can't just take as a given, I don't think, hey, once you hit 25, however you got to wherever you are in life, let's let markets rip. Because it's very clear what happens in those early years in families and in communities has a vast implication for the amount of talent that you have and therefore the scalability of your talents in today's global economy. That's what we need to address, I believe. So I put this out, if the message is just tax the 1%ers and the billionaires, I understand the earnestness of that, and I agree that we need to elevate taxes on a lot of people in America, if we're going to solve the fiscal indebtedness, and that would have to, if we don't get faster productivity growth, that'll help. And high net worth, high income individuals need to be part of that. But if that's all that we're talking about, that will not rebuild the American dream.
I'm searching for a good ending question, but I might try this one.
Sure.
Matt, do you expect the rule of law to hold for the foreseeable future in the U.S.?
Yes.
Good.
I don't say that cavalierly. I am worried. We have times in our country where the three branches of government have juxtaposed to clashed. We're living through that now. I'm a Tigger. I firmly believe there's enough people that are committed to our democracy and its institutions that it will persist. And I am also a Tigger, as I said, I realize a lot of the topics we're talking about, they're like, really glad I came today. But it's just, it's remarkable. We all know this in our lives, like our personal lives, the firms or organizations we're part of. Things can change really quickly. And oftentimes it's leaders that can spark that change. And so whether it's some of these individuals or some of these individuals or whatever, pictures aren't up there, right? But in our communities and there's a lot of businesses where people they're rolling up their sleeves and trying to figure this out, right? And again, I come back to, for me, I'm just always struck at that. We talked about President Kennedy's invocations and reasons that he gave for articulating a vision of succeeding in space and setting the goals of putting a person on the moon. It was about collective effort, sacrifice, risk-taking, teamwork. And I think almost everybody in this room, who's, for whatever walks of life we got to, like, we know what that means, you know what I mean? And so, in a prosaic sense, in a less important sense, like economists are really bad at predicting turns in the business cycle. And for reasons, I don't know why, but it is what it is. But like, I think the reason is, you try to predict the US economy, there's about 160 million workers, there's about 35 million businesses of different structures, and their collective energy and efforts is really hard to predict. But there's a lot of amazing individuals who are trying to lead these organizations, and I think leaders that can come along to voice a fresh vision for America, I think there's tremendous reason to be optimistic. It's work, it's effort, it's shared, but I'm confident, I'm very, very hopeful and confident we will get there.
Matt, thank you very much for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you, everybody.